If you can hold ETH directly or use a staking service, you probably shouldn't hold the ETF because you're giving up, I don't know, 3% yield roughly. There's a little bit more that you lose taking ETH and putting in an ETF wrapper than you lose taking Bitcoin and putting in an ETF wrapper.
Hello, welcome in everybody to another Coinage chat here, news recap. I'm the host of Coinage, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios in New York City. Happy Monday, big weekend of news as President Biden bows out of the race. Going to be chatting that and the impacts, but of course, also a big week already because we have the ETH ETFs kicking off this week, and a lot of excitement and enthusiasm built around those as we wait to see exactly how much money flows into those. And of course, we'll be chatting with James Seyffart, Bloomberg Intelligence ETF analyst, in just a bit here on the show to get his thoughts on how those are shaping up. We've already seen that once before with the Bitcoin ETFs, and now excited to watch it all play out. Going to be covering that for you at coinage.media, as we always do, the biggest headlines in crypto there. Of course, shout out to today's sponsor on the show, Mezzo, a new home for Bitcoin holders to cultivate Bitcoin and grow well together. Use your BTC on Mezzo to unlock real utility and honest yield. Join Bitcoin's first open source economic layer today. That is what Mezzo offers. And want to kick off the show by just taking a look at the charts right now. Bitcoin's price, as we say in the Chiron here, topping 67,000 after Biden drops out. It's pretty much on that level right now, more or less, around that 67,000 level. We're going to dig into why JP Morgan thinks that is perhaps just a local top, a temporary pop, not to be trusted. Why JP Morgan's saying that in just a sec. But first, I want to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of what we're about to see play out with Ethereum ETFs and just, I think, kind of what it can do. As we always do on the Monday show, we look at CoinShares asset flows for the past week. And the charts there, nothing really changing from what we've seen. Another big week of flows in terms of money pouring into the Bitcoin ETFs. And I think this is why so many people are excited about the ETH ETFs, is because you're going to have, perhaps, we've seen over the last couple of weeks, according to CoinShares, money from Ethereum kind of shuffling around in the existing products outside of the US as people prepare for these ETH ETFs to come in. And, you know, nothing really changed there. Still just enthusiasm. The big story being that a lot of people held, even though Bitcoin's price dropped. The majority, it's actually quite surprising. It was 1.35 billion last week. So 3 straight number go up bars in that chart we just showed you right there. 3-week run of inflows north of 3 billion over just the 3 weeks. The majority of those, out of 1.35 billion, 1.27 are Bitcoin related in terms of the ETFs, which again just goes to show those are the instrument of choice for investors right now. And that is exactly why Ethereum ETFs are so big and why this week is so monumental in what we're seeing play out. And there are some people who are saying, wait a minute, if you've got Ethereum ETFs, that might start to cannibalize what we've seen with the pop in Bitcoin due to the Bitcoin ETFs. We chatted with Bitwise's Matt Hogan, the CIO there, about potentially if there's any truth to that idea. And he was in the no camp for that. Maybe not too surprising given Bitwise both has a Bitcoin ETF and now an Ethereum ETF launching. But at least it was based on what he's hearing from asset advisors, wealth advisors. Take a listen to what he told us last week.
I really don't think these ETFs will cannibalize what we've seen in Bitcoin. And I'll point to a conversation I had with the CEO of an advisory platform that manages over $100 billion of assets. And what he told me was he was uncomfortable letting his advisors who work for them allocate just to Bitcoin because he'd been trained in the world of indexing and diversification. He was really excited for the potential of getting a spot Ethereum ETFs because then his team could invest in both Bitcoin and Ethereum, have a diversified position in crypto, and he felt much more comfortable about that. So I think this is actually an accelerant even to Bitcoin ETF flows, which I know is counterintuitive. If you think professional investors want to move into this space, and that's a source of major inflows, I think they're going to be happier having 2 assets than they were having won. So I see it again as additive.
So that's the hope. And again, I guess we'll know soon enough as we get, a full week. Well, not this week, but we'll get a full week next week of how these inflows are looking. And of course, the hope and the thought outside of just Matt Hogan, but also the other experts, and we'll be chatting with Bloomberg's James Seyffart in just a sec, but also Sean Farrell, kind of in the same camp of we could see $5 billion in the first, call it 5 months or so, of these, which would be huge, absolutely amazing if we do see that. And that's kind of where a lot of the smart people in crypto are saying this could go. What that means for price, a little bit less clear, but you do have potentially, seen price targets maybe hit 5K. We talked earlier in the year about what Sean Farrell's price target is, which I think we'll get into a Solana call. That's later on in the show. Solana to 500. We'll be discussing that in a little bit, but obviously huge week for Ethereum ETFs. No need to belabor that point necessarily. Also, it's not just big for Ethereum. Obviously, it's big for Bitcoin as well because it's Bitcoin Nashville, Bitcoin 2024, the largest crypto conference. We chatted with the organizers there last week about what they're expecting. I don't know if you saw this, but you got Trump speaking down there. We talked to him about the security measures that they're going to be adding coming off the RNC. But you also got Elon Musk changing his eyes. You've got some people maybe speculating, these are just rumors from people watching Bitcoin Nashville, saying potentially Elon Musk could go down there, could be the one moderating with Trump. No one really knows what's going to be happening, but you do know there's going to be a lot of politicians going down there for sure. As we already covered, senators from Tennessee, Bill Hagerty and Marsha Blackburn, going to be down there alongside Ro Khanna, who just had the Democrats talking crypto, Biden officials, of course, Biden dropping out now. But all that stuff happening this week gets kicked off, and then Trump is speaking over the weekend down in Nashville. James Seyffart's going to be down there too, so maybe we can ask him about his thoughts around his panel that's planned down there. But a lot happening, and we'll see what the final attendance is. But potentially, you had the organizers saying that they could approach the 45,000 capacity cap. We'll see if that happens necessarily or not. But clearly, a lot of headlines, and we'll be covering all of them for you at coinage.media as those come out. But clearly, a lot expected from that conference. And having been there before, it's a pretty serious one when it comes to talking about Bitcoin. And sometimes we see prices fall at these conferences. And, a lot to be discussed this time around, not just in terms of crypto in general, regulation policy, this being an election year, but I think also a very interesting chat, just kind of given what's happened in Bitcoin now, as you talk about stacks and all these other Bitcoin layer 2s, ordinals, the likes. So a lot probably to come from that conference. And certainly we will be highlighting those headlines. I want to put that on your radar for things. Also want to chat about the bear case right now, because this is one thing too, as you have all this enthusiasm around the Ethereum ETFs going live, Bitcoin Nashville. You've also got JP Morgan coming out and saying that this could be a potential mini top happening in Bitcoin right now, which, anytime we see a note like that, always kind of interesting to dig a bit into it. Just kind of given how bullish myself and other people are. Always good to hear the other side of the story. But this is the headline from the block. I think you can see this here, Texas. JP Morgan says crypto rebounds ahead, unlikely to be sustained. Look out. Uh-oh. But not too bad when you dig into the note, I think. Just kind of given where they're at. I think we have a chart, Texas, to show from this one in terms of where Bitcoin might likely drop back down to. And I got to say, I do enjoy the research from JP Morgan generally around this one. Just kind of where we're at in terms of their thesis on this. Yes, that's the one. What they say, and I think it's worth digging into, they kind of track the price of Bitcoin tied back to volatility adjusted gold prices. In that, this is the chart we're looking at. It goes back to the mean. So they're saying there's some mean reversion to be expected around this. They note that Bitcoin's current price of around 67, as we highlighted, is high compared to its production cost of 43,000 and volatility adjusted comparison to gold, which is around 53,000. So obviously, if we're at 67 and they think we should go to 53, that means prices will drop. I'm not entirely sure, though, when you think about the forward-looking nature of these things, that the best price tool to use would be backward-looking costs. I'm not in that camp, so I understand kind of the thinking around why they say this could be a little run past where prices should be looking backwards. But I think looking forward and factoring in where things might go in the future, it's tough to say that things are not rosy. If you do believe President Trump will win re-election and he will be there putting in pro-crypto policies, it's tough to say that I would give too much credit to this JP Morgan note. But again, taking nothing away from Nicolas over there, because I do like the research that comes from them. But that's kind of the bearish take right now, is that if you use some of the mean reversions in the past cycles that were running hot now and that it would be likely to come down, I would just say, based on what we just heard from Matt Hogan, that the idea of these Ethereum ETFs going live this week and all the money still waiting to pile into these products might dictate otherwise. Still in the bull camp, personally speaking. Again, not financial advice, but you should listen to me because this show's spot on. And I want to highlight one other price call that we've been waiting to see play out. I think that this one's quite interesting, and want to pull up the chart for Solana just to kind of dig into where we are, because it was a huge call and one that I myself have taken as financial advice, as I often do. Sean Farrell from Fundstrat has been spot on. And just looking at the chart here, Texas, this is where we are at right now in Solana over the last, let's bring up the year chart here. 178 is where we sit right now. Again, wild to think back when FTX collapsed where we were just not even a year ago, October 2023. Wild down here at $27. Now you're at 180. And this is the call that I am highlighting here on Coinage. You can go check out that interview and hear Sean Farrell's thoughts on why we get to $500 on Solana. And these are the headlines right now. Solana ETFs driving hopes. Now, I think that's why it was important to ask Commissioner Peirce, who we had on Coinage last week, about the Solana ETFs, about her thoughts on whether or not we might get those. Because if price is going up because people are bullish on the idea of ETFs, I've got some bad news. As we've highlighted before, these things are not the same as Bitcoin and Ethereum when it comes to those getting greenlit. Of course, that could all change if you don't have Gary Gensler at the SEC post a Trump victory. So maybe I'm the idiot for pointing that out and saying, don't expect these to be greenlit. However, big caveat, things could change. Here's what Hester Peirce told us last week when we were trying to get at the heart of the issue. What makes a Solana ETF that different than Bitcoin and Ethereum? The difference, for those who don't know, is that Solana doesn't have CME futures. So there's not exactly the same green light already in place for Solana ETFs to get greenlit, which is why perhaps some of these headlines talking about optimism there might be getting ahead of themselves. But here's what she told us when we tried to pry and see if she thinks Solana ETFs are anywhere near getting approved. Take a listen.
You know, we have to look at the facts and circumstances, and what people need to do is they need to take prior precedent with ETPs, and not just crypto ETPs, but with other kinds of ETPs, and make the case that they can be approved under under our existing laws and rules. And so we really have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. This environment with crypto is so difficult, of course, because there are questions around what my colleagues and I are going to think is a security and not. There are all these kinds of questions. But again, we really should just take the existing precedent and apply it to whatever the facts and circumstances are.
Now, to be clear, Hester Peirce did correctly predict and told us back in an interview in January that ETH ETFs would be, as she said, she didn't say they would be approved. She said that she hoped that there wouldn't be a drawn-out legal battle like we saw with Bitcoin ETFs. And she was correct about that because the same rules applied from the Bitcoin ETFs to the Ethereum ETFs. There was a deadline and there were legal rulings in the courts that said that they couldn't deny these Bitcoin ETFs, that there was arbitrary and capricious. And so they were kind of forced to approve Ethereum ETFs, but without some of those market structures being in place for Solana, not necessarily the case. And as James Seyffart told us just a couple weeks ago, likely that the deadline on these new Solana ETF applications from Van Eck and 21 Shares probably wouldn't even be on the SEC's radar until 2025. Again, all of this could change if you don't have Gary Gensler running the show, but important to consider. And Texas, if we take a look at the chart again, it is still pretty wild just to see kind of where Solana is at and the way that it's battled back. It was one thing to just say, hey, look how crazy this has been from a year ago. But look at it even before that, and you might say, okay, 233 back in 2021, crazy times. But now, less crazy times when we're talking about an ETF. Again, not going to happen tomorrow, but most likely is going to happen, I think. And how small Solana's relative share of the market is to Bitcoin and Ethereum, it's not easy anymore. Like, I remember hearing this price call. This was a crazy price call when Sean Farrell told us. And I was like, I don't know. Maybe not. But now, here we are waiting for a Solana ETF, and we're at 177, and it could all potentially happen. And I got to say, it makes a lot of sense. So shout out to Sean Farrell for that call back then, as we sit and wait for a Solana ETF potential news there. But anyways, I want to get back to the Ethereum ETF news because that is definitely happening, as we know. And the smartest man covering all of that action, great dude. Happy to have him back on the show. We just made this happen. James Seyffart back on Coinage. James, good to see you, man.
Smartest man. I don't know if that's the crew, but I'll take the compliment.
That's true. It's you and Eric running the show, man, and leading the charge. It's literally putting on a clinic, as far as I'm concerned, in covering these things. And I want to bring up Texas, the little chart that James has already prepared, Bloomberg Intelligence here, looking at all these ETFs. Man, it's been a while since we chatted, so now that you have all the facts and all the fees and everything's basically ready to go here, I think you said before we were in the 20 to 25% camp for inflows. Curious to see if that's changed in your mind or just kind of general thoughts on what we're about to see play out.
Yeah, I mean, my base case is probably around the 20% mark. I'd say like 15 to 20% would be a solid, that would be a solid success as far as I'm concerned. That's kind of where I'm expecting things to be. 20 plus, 20 to 25 kind of makes sense. I think getting to 30 and above is kind of unlikely, at least near term, in my view. So we'll see. We'll see how this shakes out in a couple weeks. But I think anything less than 15% and that 10% of the flows that Bitcoin ETFs got, I think is kind of a that's not a good look. But again, we're just not seeing the same level of interest. So if we're talking to people across the traditional financial universe, advisors, you name it, there just doesn't seem to be the same level of excitement or interest around these things. I mean, you can just look at the media coverage, the reads that we're getting on the stuff that we're putting out there, the reads that our news colleagues are getting when they put the stuff out there. The interest is pales in comparison. If we go off of the interest that we're seeing in media reads, I would say that even 15% is a way overestimation. So time will tell.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I haven't really, outside of the crypto spheres, you never really know how these things are going to go or where the interest is. But I think in general, one of the elements that a lot of people, at least, I was talking about Sean Farrell's analysis here. One of the things that people do look at is this idea of grayscale outflows and how much is going to bleed from that, similar to what we saw with Bitcoin ETFs. With the Ethereum trust, much smaller. And you would think maybe Grayscale would drop their fee based on what we saw play out with Bitcoin ETFs. They did not. Curious to get your reaction to that and the expectations around bleeding out from Grayscale this time.
Honestly, I would say this is actually one of the more positive things when you're looking at Bitcoin versus Ethereum. When you looked at GBTC, I mean, you had FTX, you had Gemini and Genesis tied up in there, you had BlockFi, and you name it, anyone that went bankrupt from 2020 to 2023, that was probably tied up in some way with GBTC. So there was tons of estates that were looking to unload their GBTC shares. I'm sure there is some estates that still have some ETH. I think for the most part, most of them sold some of those exposures because they weren't sure when an Ethereum ETF was going to be approved. So the level of overhang of people that are undoubtedly going to be unloading their shares, I don't think is quite as high as we saw with Bitcoin. So while yes, the interest isn't as high, I'm expecting the forced sellers to be a little bit lower on the Ethereum side for ETH. And also you have Grayscale launching their mini trust. So 10% of the shares of ETH are going to go, well, I shouldn't say shares, 10% of the assets in ETH are going to go into their mini trust, which is the lowest cost provider right now. And it's going to have a fee of 0 as you're showing there. So, I mean, that should alleviate some of it. There's undoubtedly going to be some outflows. There's some people that bought this thing solely to play the premium, the discount collapse when these things convert to an ETF.
I may have been in that camp. I may have been in that camp.
Yeah,
Just throwing.
theoretically, you could have sold now. I mean, it's been a virtual 0% discount ever since these things got approved in May. So there's no saying that there's that many people tied up in there. I think there's probably some people that are tied up in that are going to wait till like after a year for long-term capital gains to come into play. But yeah, I think that overhang is there. There's a supply overhang. There's going to be people unloading those shares. I just think it was a much bigger pressure point for the Bitcoin side of things than it is for ETH.
Yeah, I would agree. And I also feel like, one of the other elements that we got from our Commissioner Peirce interview, which is up there on YouTube now, but one of the headlines, I just have it up, Texas, if you want to see that. She mentioned that potentially some of these could be approved to stake in the future. Again, that's just her view. And as we chatted last time, James, I think, all of this could be up in the air depending on what happens in November. So it doesn't really matter all that much. But interesting to kind of hear her thoughts on maybe one piece that could move the needle. I'm not sure if staking would necessarily change your guys' model at all in terms of what could flow in, but obviously something that was left on the table didn't happen. Curious about your thoughts on kind of how staking being left out changes anything with this launch.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that was an awesome interview, and
Thank you very much.
I love to hear those things from Hester. Yeah. But it definitely impacts it, right? So if you can hold ETH directly or use a staking service, being that like you're not in institutions that's restricted from doing something like that, you probably shouldn't hold the ETF because you're giving up, I don't know, 3% yield roughly, and that can be viewed as an expense ratio. So yeah. Grayscale's ETH has a 2.5% expense ratio. That's high, but also if you also like just look at the fact that you can't stake and add another 3% on top of that, it's even worse. So no matter how you slice it, it's not a great look. That said, even the ETFs that do staking in Canada and in Europe, it's not like they're staking 100% of the assets because you need some liquid share, right? You need some ethereum that you can unload in order to meet redemptions in the case of outflows. So it's never going to be fully like 100% exposure to staked ethereum in an ETF wrapper just because of the need for liquidity. So they'll do something like 40%, 30% of the ETH is staked in ETFs like that internationally. That said, I 100% think that's going to potentially dampen the impact or demand of these ETFs. We know for a fact there was a lot of people that took some of their direct Bitcoin exposure and just swapped that out to go into the ETF just because it fits more in line with like their traditional financial portfolio and things like that. I think with Ethereum, you lose a lot more utility than you do with Bitcoin. You obviously lose utility with Bitcoin. You're not sovereign. You don't own not your keys, not your coins, what have you. That's the same case for ETH, but also ETH has a little bit more utility. You also lose the staking yield. There's a little bit more that you lose taking ETH and putting in an ETF wrapper than you lose taking Bitcoin and putting in an ETF wrapper. And this is not to say you don't lose anything by taking Bitcoin and putting an ETF wrapper, but I think you lose a little bit more with Ethereum because I know there's Bitcoin maxis potential listen to this, like ready to rip my head off for saying.
They're there. They're always waiting in the wings to rip someone's head off, James. And if it's not going to be yours, it's going to be mine. So I'm glad you pointed that out. But I do think it is exciting, just regardless, to kind of sit here. And I know there are still some Solana questions I want to ask you, but just kind of as you sit here, having done this now twice, right, in your rise to fame, as we discussed last time. Not just in covering the Bitcoin ETFs being launched, but also kind of the ETH ETF approvals as they happened in the spring. And you and I kind of jockeyed in terms of the likelihood of those. But I think you're right. It caught a lot of people by surprise. And so maybe it's not surprising that like the news coverage isn't there for it this time around because maybe some people still aren't sure that these are actually happening. And they're definitely happening. We're going to see them tomorrow. So what are you going to be watching other than inflows kind of this time versus the Bitcoin ETFs? As you mentioned, kind of similar, but also maybe not entirely similar. Is there anything on your radar that you would point out this time around?
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing I'll be watching is the trading volume. You can kind of force money in, and honestly, the first day won't be very indicative of much. I think the first day will be a lot of these companies are going to have some money lined up from some big time investors that are planning to invest in these things. It'll be more interesting to see the week to 2 weeks to a month out what actually happens. And one way to really gauge that interest off the bat, like within the first week or two, is going to be looking at volumes, like how much trading is actually happening in these ETFs, and we can compare that to what the Bitcoin ETF saw. I'm expecting them to be a decent amount smaller on the trading volume side, but yeah, who knows? That's going to be the number one thing I'm watching, even more so than flows necessarily on the first day or two.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised just to see the on your chart that you put out, kind of again Coinbase cleaning up on the custodian side, and that was kind of surprising the first time around with Bitcoin ETFs. I thought maybe potentially we might see differences this time around. Did not, in that most all of them went with Coinbase. Fidelity, of course, still their own custodian, but I don't know if that was surprising to you too. But there are some concentration risks that you got to think the SEC is thinking about with some of that stuff. I don't know. Maybe that's just
Yeah,
me.
I think we are going to see some diversification of we're going to see some diversification of the custodians, right? We've already seen a filing from Hashdex to hold both Bitcoin and Ethereum. I don't know the exact deadline of that, but it's a few months out. And they're going to use BitGo and Gemini, I believe. We know that for Valkyrie's filing their ticker BUR, their Bitcoin ETF, they already have the ability to use Coinbase and BitGo. I think we're going to see more of that over time, but for the most part, it seems like just anyone who has already launched Bitcoin ETF and is now launching Ethereum ETF, they're just keeping their partners the same. But yeah, I do think there is a little bit of a concentration risk right now. It's kind of Coinbase's lead to lose, but I do think that there's likely to be diversification in the coming years, where even within ETFs, there will be possibly multiple custodians. That said, who knows? I guess iShares or BlackRock specifically, they've been partnered with Coinbase for a long time. So it might just be that a lot of these firms are just partnered up tight with one custodian. I mean, Fidelity's not going to likely diversify their custodian. Fidelity's just going to keep using Fidelity. But I think some of these other issues are going to diversify some of that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I feel like, looking ahead, right? The Ethereum ETF and the difference between the Grayscale product and the I guess the discount that was there was because so many people didn't think that this would happen. I do want to ask you about Solana ETFs, because that was one thing that we chatted with Hester Peirce in our interview too. And the idea there being when James Seyffart thinks that this might come through, if that's changed at all, because I think you and I were on the same page that 2025 would be the earliest, like deep into 2025 would be the earliest, just given the process. I mean, so much is up in the air now that Biden's out. I'm curious where your head's at when it comes to Solana ETFs.
Yeah, I mean the actual deadline isn't completely set, but it's likely to be sometime in late March for the Solana filings from 21 Shares and VanEck. So I just don't think it's likely that it's going to be approved then. I mean, you might need a little act of Congress to get some sort of thing situated with the market structure. Is Solana a security? The SEC thinks so. CFTC seems to not. The SEC is actually alleging that in actual lawsuits against Kraken and Coinbase and others. Who has jurisdiction, the CFTC or SEC? I mean, all of this needs to kind of be sorted out. And even if you do get somebody like Trump into the White House and he decides he follows through on some of the promises he's made to be pro crypto and do different things, like it's the end of March. I mean, he gets in the White House sometime in January. Like, is it really going to be his number one priority to get a new SEC commissioner and get that changed and around in time for a Solana ETF to launch? I don't know. I tend to think it's kind of unlikely, but again, it's not completely out of the question is the way I'm looking at it. But you need right now, the process is you need a futures market, you need potentially a futures ETF, but you definitely need a futures market that can be surveilled, or you need a surveillable market, and then you can get an ETF. Theoretically, if you get some sort of surveillance sharing agreements with the likes of Coinbase and Kraken or Binance even, or Gemini, and you add all them up, then all of a sudden the SEC will have plenty of ability to surveil the underlying market and look for fraud and manipulation, and then they wouldn't really be able to deny this thing. But then again, we saw BlackRock file initially for their Bitcoin ETF. One of the reasons everyone was bullish was because they had a surveillance sharing agreement with Coinbase. That was one of the reasons why we upped our odds in the summer, last summer, because we thought, oh my gosh, this might actually happen. This should satisfy the SEC's concerns. And then the SEC basically made them take that out. Like, they were like, we don't want this surveillance sharing agreement. We're just going to use the futures market because of what happened with the Grayscale lawsuit and what the court said. So who knows? Under this admin, I think the odds, like if Gensler is still at the SEC come the end of March, I think the odds of this happening are very, very, very slim, near zero, absent like I said, a literal act of Congress. Other than that, I think it's still less than 50% odds that it would happen, but we need to see what happens in November and what's actually going to go on with the SEC.
Yeah, I'm kind of
Sorry, that
caught
was
in it.
long-winded.
No. I mean, it's there's a lot of nuance to these things, and so I think it's important to include. And I also feel like it's the same. I'm in the same camp. It's like whatever happens in November is going to dictate this one. But I will say, it does seem kind of an inevitability of all of this, and I think that that's kind of like the thing. Stepping back and looking at it, as we highlighted, the $500 price call from Sean Farrell that we covered earlier this year does seem like kind of, if you follow what happened with Bitcoin and Ethereum, and I guess we'll see this play out this week. But if there is kind of a vehicle that is regulated and trusted that people can go into the next thing, and Solana's sitting there, that a $500 price call doesn't seem crazy anymore. And the risk reward, as I even was talking to friends this week out on the golf course, the risk reward here seems pretty wild in kind of how people who are outside crypto 100% of the time might be overlooking something like that. I don't know. I know you and I don't often talk about price, but it does seem like, as a man who's covered this, it is interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah, literally not allowed to talk about price, to be quite honest. But also, Sean has been great. Fundstrat has been awesome in this coverage, and honestly, the Tom Lee who runs Fundstrat, I mean, he absolutely nailed like all of the calls in the equity markets for 2023. So, have to completely respect everything that they're saying as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, I don't know. I can't really talk about price calls, but I will say that I think it's rather unlikely we see this thing approved in March. That said, I agree with, if you look at Galaxy Research and a bunch of other things in the crypto space, or a lot of the people I talk to tend to be kind of like an overlap between TradFi and DeFi. They kind of view Solana as the third chain. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense that you should be looking at and comparing to what's next. It just seems right now, as things are lined up, Solana is unlikely to happen in the first quarter, but I would, again, it comes back to November. And then I guess but also like just looking at what's going on with TradFi and the ETFs, like that's not the only thing that dictates price, right? There's a lot of usage that's happening right now in Solana, irrespective of your views about decentralization and monolithic versus, I forget what the other one is, but what Ethereum is technically called, but irrespective of those views, there's a lot of things happening on Solana directly.
Yes, those Bitcoin maxis are in the comments, and I think it's impacting both of us. And I think it's a good segue back to the Bitcoin conference where you're going to be speaking, actually. Shout out to this panel. Looking at it right now here, ETF flows, a passing fad, ? Which I think we know the answer to that one, as Matt Hogan already shared with us last week. But you're going to be up there on the stage with him and Van Eck and BlackRock. So, congrats on being featured out there. I'm sad I'm not going to be out in Nashville myself. But it is, I guess, give us a preview of what this panel is going to be on, because I do think it's so funny to be sitting here thinking about all the way back in January. I mean, now kind of where the maturity of those ETFs or Bitcoin ETFs, let's give the Bitcoin crowd some shine here. I mean, what are you looking at in terms of the maturity of those? Already some of the most successful ETF launches, but kind of what's the second chapter looking like for you? Not just, I guess, volumes and inflows, but kind of where we're at macro picture with those things.
Yeah, I mean, they've been an absolute smashing success. And if you, so when you say macro, I mean, I guess it depends. Like Larry Fink is now coming out on CNBC talking this about a safe haven asset. BlackRock is pushing that narrative. So I often tend to view Bitcoin as a risk on asset, right? I view it as a risk asset similar to stocks, but that correlation has severely broken down in recent terms, which is a good thing, I think, for the asset overall, because this thing is supposed to be uncorrelated, and it's showing that it's uncorrelated right now, right? That said, the whole thing is we're going to talk about like what is next, where is the next level of demand going to come from? I mean, one of those things is obviously the big wirehouses, the brokerages, the UBSs of the world, the Morgan Stanleys of the world, Merrill Lynch. They have like trillions of dollars that in their wealth management platforms, and they cannot buy these things yet. How much demand is going to come from there? I'm going to try to get these guys to give me an idea. But even if you look at that and you say like 10% of advisors are going to put 10% of their clients into one of these ETFs, and they're going to put it at like a 2% allocation of the portfolio, that's meaningful assets that will come to these products. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but that is probably more money that's coming down the line. But it's hard to know exactly where this is going to come from and when it's going to happen. I think if you ask them, I'm going to find out for sure. I think most people are thinking the fourth quarter at some point when these things could get greenlit at those platforms. I mean, I feel like I see a news story like every other month about like Morgan Stanley is about ready to approve these things to be greenlit. And I've been hearing it for like 4 months, but like nothing has happened. So I'm sticking with my end of third quarter. I was saying third or fourth quarter. I guess we're in the third quarter now, but yeah, I think we're looking more into the fall potentially, but I guess it's not out of the question based on some of the news stories I'm seeing. It's just they just keep kicking that can down the road.
Yeah, it's a waiting game, but it is, again, just kind of stepping back and looking at where we're at. A lot has happened this year, and you've been front and center and covering it. Again, very job well done. I got to say that for everyone here at Coinage. Phenomenal to watch James Seyffart in the wild doing his thing, and excited to see it all play out again this week. And congrats on speaking at Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville. Everyone should be watching that talk. Everyone's going to be, I myself, am going to be watching to see what comes out from that chat. James Seyffart from Bloomberg Intelligence, thanks so much for coming back on, man. There's a short notice. You hopped on with us. Thank you, and congrats.
Yeah, you're welcome. I will also add real quick that I'm also doing a fireside chat with Robbie Mitchnick, who's on that panel, and we're just going to talk about BlackRock's like foray into like going from complete skeptic, non-believer to like literal bear on the entire space to becoming a bull.
Being one of the biggest voices and most important voices out there. Now it's gonna be sick, man. Have fun down there, and thank you again for hopping on. We'll chat again soon. For James Seyffart, for myself, for everybody here at Coinage, that's going to do it for this show. As always, all the biggest headlines in Web3 at coinage.media, and you can co-own our project as well to help steer the coverage and become a full member with a path to patronage, dividends. Join our cooperative. All the details at coinage.media. For everybody, thanks for tuning in again. We'll see you again soon.